Well, Chanute Field was actually created to train pilots for World War I. And so it's been around, since 1917, 1918. After World War I, the field sort of had some ups and downs. But when we got into the 30s and sort of war clouds started building over Europe, Chanute went through what was called its Renaissance, where all of basically the World War I infrastructure was replaced with at the time would have been, cutting edge, brand new hangars and training facilities. And what Chanute became was, the best technical training facility for the U.S. Army Air Corps. So what that meant was their role was not so much to train pilots, but to train everybody else who would support pilots in that mission. So mechanics, sheet metal workers, basically the laundry list of the types of technical fields that are needed to allow the pilots to fly and complete the mission. The 99th comes in 1941, and we need to start a little bit before that. So at that time, there was no United States Air Force. That was something that occurred after World War II. Prior to that, what we call the Air Force today was part of the United States Army, and it was the United States Army Air Corps, United States Army Air Forces. So part of the Army, a division of the Army. Before 1941, African Americans were entirely excluded from Air Corps service in basically any capacity. And the reasons for that stem back to World War I. African American soldiers did serve in World War I in combat capacity. And it wasn't a great experience. So after the war, after World War I, the War Department did a study on the ability of African Americans to serve as soldiers. This report came out in 1925 and basically said that African Americans were not smart enough. They did not have the courage to be a soldier, basically relegating African Americans to service roles in the military. So, cooks, truck drivers, service jobs, no combat, no technical jobs, because the study said that, they weren't able to do it. When we look at this study today, we see that their reasoning is entirely false. The science they use is just wrong. And it really denigrated the service of African Americans in World War I. The 93rd Infantry, for example, was a unit that was largely formed, I believe, from men from Chicago. And they served in World War I. They were under French command, and they did exceptionally well. No issues at all. The units that were under American command did very poorly. And the reason they did poorly is because there could be no black officers. So the white officers that were assigned to these black units probably were not good officers. They didn't want to be there. So the training wasn't good. And so the results were as expected. It had nothing to do with the soldiers being African American or not. It had to do with bad officers and bad training. So that sets the stage when we get into the late 30s, early 40s. It's looking like we're going to be getting into World War II. And at that time, this war study was used to legitimize excluding African Americans from becoming fighter pilots or serving in a technical. We also need to keep in mind that during World War II, most of the United States military leadership were products of World War I. The higher ranking officers almost all served in World War I. So as they were coming up in their military career, they were sort of indoctrinated with this idea that, hey, we did this study and it says that African Americans cannot do these things. And so it was a struggle to break through that misconception. So beginning in the late 30s, early 40s, advocates really started applying a lot of pressure to the War Department to allow African Americans to serve equally in the United States Army, including the Air Corps, which meant, let African Americans be pilots, let them be mechanics, give them an equal opportunity to serve. One of the African American newspapers in the country, the Courier, actually came out and summed it up pretty well. They said, "We'll fight for our country, but we demand to fight as equals." And that tone just continued to ramp up to allow African Americans to serve in the Air Corps, and the Air Corps became it was a highly visible, highly technical target for that advocacy. If we, that made a statement. If we can get African Americans into the Air Corps, that's a huge visible step forward that'll hopefully lead into other opportunities for getting rid of discrimination, segregation, a gateway in the military to try and make things equitable and equal. Pressure mounted, the War Department finally acquiesced, and in January of 1941, they basically said, fine, we're going to create one Pursuit Squadron, what we would call a fighter squadron today, and we'll give it a try. The term experiment was used. We're going to try it. A lot of people in the military, the attitude was, we know it's going to fail, so let's just do it and get it over with. And for the African American community and others, it was an opportunity to not fail and show them how wrong these preconceptions were. Excuse me. However, when the War Department announced this, no one was happy. So the military was not happy because they felt that this was just, an appeasement strategy. We don't want this black squadron. You're just doing this to get the activists off your back, and now we're going to be saddled with this. The activists were not happy because this squadron was going to be fully segregated. And for them, that was not equal. That was basically taking the cultural norms of the day and then just transferring it over into the military. They wanted equal, desegregated opportunities to serve. So no one was 100% happy with how this was going to go. The next issue, and to take a step back, it sometimes wondered, why, fighter squadrons today are kind of, are the really high visual, guys and men and women who are flying, right? It's the Tom Cruises, it's the Top Gun, Why would the military, if they didn't want this squadron, basically pick a highly visual, highly technical unit? Why weren't they making a transport squadron or a bomber squadron, or something that would be less visual, I guess? Well, and the reason for that was economics. Fighter squadrons required fewer people to train. The equipment was cheaper, smaller airplanes, and it required less crewmen. So a fighter plane needs one pilot. A bomber needs pilot, co-pilot, crew members. So a fighter squadron was, in a way, the lowest investment that they could make. Now, advocates looked at that entirely the opposite way. Hey, they're giving us an opportunity in, one of the most, visual, exciting types of unit in the Air Corps. We're gonna take advantage of this, and they did. So usually when a squadron was formed, you would be able to pull key officers and personnel from other places in the Air Corps. Well, because this was an all-black squadron, there weren't any. There were no people to pull into this squadron, so everybody had to be trained. Officers, pilots, everybody. There was no experience that was coming into this squadron, because there couldn't be, because African Americans weren't allowed to gain that experience. So the question was, how, for the War Department, is how are we going to do this? It had to be segregated, because that was one of the deals. And so they had to find a place to do this training. Usually different career fields would train at different bases. So during World War II, I think armaments training was done at Lowry Field in Colorado. Communications was done, I think in Ohio, someplace. Engine mechanics were trained at Chanute. They couldn't do that. Segregated units, so everybody has to sort of be together. So they had to find a place that they could do all of this training to get the squadron up to speed. Because their intention was they're going to build a base just for this African American squadron, and that was Tuskegee. So in 1941, Tuskegee Army Airfield was in the process of being constructed, but it wasn't done yet. So they couldn't begin training as quickly as they wanted to. And also, the military truly thought that it was going to take so long to train men in the technical fields like engine mechanics, sheet metal workers, that they had to start training immediately. And so they couldn't wait for Tuskegee Army Airfield to get done and sort of do all the training there. They had to start ahead of the game because, again, they assumed that African Americans did not have the mental capacity to do these technical things. So they needed to find a place. Some bases across the United States made it pretty darn clear that they didn't want an African American squadron at their base. And so there was some jockeying about we don't want those guys here. Well, they had to put them somewhere, and so it landed at Chanute Field. One of the reasons I believe is that Chanute Field at that time was the state-of-the-art technical training facility in the Army Air Corps, and it would give them the best training they could possibly get was at Chanute. And so, Chanute was chosen, and it turned out pretty well, all things considered. All training was done there. So every technical field, from armaments, communication, sheet metal workers, mechanics, parachute riggers, was all done at Chanute. The one thing that was not done at Chanute was pilot training. Pilot training was all done at Tuskegee. So in March of 1941, the 99th Pursuit Squadron was activated at Chanute Field. What that means is that the first unit of what later would be called Tuskegee Airmen actually was born in Rantoul, Illinois, not Tuskegee, Alabama. So that's a pretty big deal. The first of the first were in Rantoul. And so immediately, as soon as the War Department announced that the squadron was going to be activated, volunteers just started flooding in. And what's remarkable is the men that were volunteering for this squadron were highly educated. All had to have a high school education. That was normal. But many had college degrees. Many had advanced degrees. Highly intelligent, highly skilled individuals. Some of these men probably knew how to do their job better before they even started training. I mean, these were just, cream of the crop, some of the best people in general for a squadron to be successful. And so about 270 some enlisted men came to Chanute to train. And then there were 6 officers that came to train. The first officers of the Tuskegee Airmen, official Tuskegee Airmen 99th Pursuit Squadron trained at Chanute. Remember, I said there were no black officers, so everybody had to be trained. So this was taking a squadron from nothing and getting everybody trained up. So enlisted men, officers, all started training before the pilots even started training down at Tuskegee. Chanute was segregated. And so I mentioned that in the 40s, Chanute was just sort of coming out of that Renaissance period where new buildings, new barracks, new training facilities, new hangars. The men of the 99th were not allowed to use those facilities. Their barracks were in some of the old buildings that remained from the World War I section of the base. So, and literally across the tracks from the rest of the base. During the construction process, they actually ran a spur rail line sort of into the base to haul in construction material. And that spur line sort of separated the old World War I section of the base from the new fancy World War II section. And so, these men were literally on the other side of the tracks from the rest of the base. They were not issued the same uniforms as their white counterparts. Even the officers who were technically officer training cadets were not issued the normal uniforms. So it was not equal by any stretch of the imagination. The other thing that also gets forgotten a bit is the 99th weren't the only African American personnel at Chanute, because the squadron itself and those men needed people to support them. So quartermaster people, cooks, service people. So other African American soldiers in the Army were brought in to basically serve the 99th Pursuit Squadron. The military was very fussy about never having an African American outrank a white soldier. So when we're training officers, there's always that tension. We need to maintain segregation. And so they did that, at least to start. When training started, they realized pretty quickly that segregation wasn't going to work. I mean, so if you're training an engine mechanic, there is a series of classes that they have to take. Well, there's only so many hours in the day and so many instructors. And so now if you have to be entirely segregated, you now need to teach those classes twice. Once for African-American students and once for white students. They couldn't get it done. It wasn't happening. So Chanute actually partially segregated training. The living situation was not desegregated. They were still definitely separate. They had no officers club, no intermingling, but training was partially integrated just out of pure necessity. It had to be. Some of the men talk about they never went into Rantoul, not necessarily because they couldn't, but they didn't have time to go into Rantoul, especially the officers, because they were training in a career field like armaments or communication, while at the same time doing officer training, so learning how to lead men. So they were so busy, they didn't have a lot of time to leave base anyway. Some of the other men actually came down to Champaign, where there was a club in the basement of the Lawhead School that gave the men of the 99th some place to go for, recreation purposes, that just didn't exist on base and didn't exist in Rantoul really either. And Champaign had an African-American community that welcomed them, and really tried to make life a little bit better for them. And I believe that basement club was sort of was sort of what Douglas Center would become. It started in the basement of the Lawhead School, and then the Douglas Center sort of picked up that idea and actually made an actual building and a place for that. So, and as I mentioned, volunteers were coming from all over. So there were many volunteers from Champaign, Christopher Copeland, one of the famous, probably one of the more recognizable nationally was a man named Anthony Jones, was from Champaign, and he was a very, very good boxer. And he basically gave up his boxing career and volunteered to serve in the 99th. He became a sheet metal worker, I believe, went overseas with the 99th. One of the other folks from the region was Ellsworth Dansby. He was from Decatur. He trained at Chanute, and then he would become the line chief for the 99th Squadron overseas, which basically means he was in charge of all of their airplanes. So in addition to the Chanute Rantoul connection, the people from this area also served in the 99th, which sometimes gets overlooked by some of the pilots. I don't think anyone from this area became a pilot, but a lot of many men from this area served in those technical roles. So I think that's pretty neat. So I mentioned that they started training at Chanute because the War Department felt that it was going to take these guys so long to get trained. They had to start right away. Well, that wasn't an issue. So classes started in March of 41. By the end of 41, the majority of the men had completed their training. Some had already transferred to Tuskegee. And the few that were remaining was just a length of class thing. Their coursework was just a little bit longer. But by the end of the year, those men were trained and they were at Tuskegee. So they were at Chanute for less than a year. They not only excelled, but by one account, as a group, they had one of the highest grade point average of any group of trainees in Chanute's history. So totally debunked this idea that the War Department sort of had, and that the war study sort of propped up, that, you know, these folks weren't smart enough to do the job. They were absolutely smart enough, and arguably in some cases probably smarter than some of their counterparts. Another interesting fact is the 99th was the first population of African American people ever to live in Rantoul. Prior to that, there just wasn't an African American community in Rantoul. Champaign Urbana had one, but Rantoul just didn't. So yeah, pretty remarkable to think about the obstacles that were thrown in their path from the beginning, the obstacles that they faced while at Chanute, which they not only overcame, they just blew out of the water. I mean, the facts speak for themselves. I mean, they excelled. And so they went down to Tuskegee, and things were not so great there. This is the first time, end of 1941, early 42, where the squadron was actually complete. So the squadron had its pilots and all of its technical personnel. They trained at Tuskegee, just sort of ad nauseum, because at that time, the War Department sort of had this aha moment where they realized, hey, these guys are going to be able to serve. They're going to be able to do the job. We don't want to send them. So now what are we going to do? So they just kept training, and became probably one of the most highly trained pursuit squadrons in the entire Army Air Corps, with the exception of they never got any training on how to actually fight with their airplanes. I believe they only had gunnery training once, and I don't know as they had bomb training at all. So they just kept training with, navigation and flying and maintaining the airplanes and that sort of thing. When they first got to Tuskegee, the base commander at Tuskegee at the time, who was a white officer, complained about Chanute because, as I mentioned, Chanute partially integrated training. So the men of the 99th at least had a small taste of some integration in the military. At Tuskegee, that was not permitted. And so the base commander at Tuskegee actually complained that Chanute was not segregating properly, and that that was really creating problems for him, because the men of the 99th assumed that some of those same courtesies that were applied to them at Chanute, which should have been applied to them always, would apply at Tuskegee, and they did not. So it was a much different experience. Tuskegee is also the first time that the 99th actually had their first black commanding officer. At Chanute, there were no black officers. So at Chanute, their commanding officer was white. When they completed their training, now there were black officers. When they got to Tuskegee, it then truly became an all-black squadron. So again, they hung out at Tuskegee for far longer than any other white squadron would have, until pressure mounted to the point where the War Department had to send them overseas. And so in 1943, they went to North Africa. They had indoctrination training in North Africa, which is really where they first learned how to fight. They were not doing, so today we think of the Tuskegee Airmen as, red-tailed P-51s escorting bombers over Europe. They were not doing that. They were flying P-40s, and they were basically dropping bombs in support of ground troops, so close air support. They were also a 4th squadron. So usually squadrons are grouped together in 3s, which then becomes a fighter group. So a fighter group has 3 squadrons. Well, the 99th was a single squadron that was always getting tacked onto a white fighter group. So they were always sort of the odd squadron out in more ways than one. A lot of these squadrons didn't want these guys with them, and so it made it pretty bad. There were lots of things that went on where white personnel would try and make the 99th look bad, schedule group meetings and then change the times without telling the men of the 99th. They would try to make their record look bad by not sending them on missions where they ever got a chance to fight. And so pretty quickly, things were looking a little rough for the squadron. They weren't getting equal opportunities to fight. As the courier said, we'll fight, but we want an equal opportunity to do it. And they really weren't being given that. When they were allowed, they excelled. They did a great job. In so much so that the British Army, who was in North Africa, had no problem with having the 99th fly close air support for them, and would actually request them because they were very, very good at close air support. One of the pilots who would later become a judge in Chicago was sort of credited as being the master at dive bombing. And they said that he could literally drop a 500-pound bomb through the window of a house. So, the skill of these men, again, getting back to that war study, was totally false. These guys could and did excel at the missions that they were given when they were given them. To kind of make a long story short, eventually 3 more fighter squadrons, all black fighter squadrons, were formed in the United States. They came over to Italy, and shortly after those fighter squadrons came, the 99th was attached to the 332nd Fighter Group with those other 3 black squadrons. And one would think that that would be a good thing, but it really made some people mad, because despite all the trouble that the 99th was having with the white squadrons that were in the fighter groups that they were assigned to, they were partially integrated. When the 99th moved to the 332nd, a lot of people basically saw that as, again, an entrenchment in maintaining and propping up segregation. We've taken the one all-black fighter squadron that was actually fighting with white squadrons, and now we're pulling them out of that and putting them with 3 all-black squadrons. So here again, we're segregated. This is the juncture where sort of the myth and the lore comes in. When the 99th joined the 332nd, about that same time, that fighter group got P-51 Mustangs. The tails on those Mustangs were painted red, bright red. All fighter groups their planes had sort of a bright color scheme, so that bomber pilots and other pilots could sort of tell what unit you were with. And the 332nds became red, the whole tail bright red, highly visible. It's where the nickname Red Tails comes from, those types of things. And the mission changed. So up until that point, the 99th had primarily been doing close air support. They joined the 332nd. The mission changes to bomber escort. So the fighter planes go with the bombers and basically protect them from enemy fighters. And this is where we get into a lot of the mythology about the 332nd never lost a bomber in combat, which isn't true. They did. But what is true is that the number of bombers they lost was incredibly low. The 332nd was arguably one of the best close air support squadrons in the entire war. So much so that they were requested by bomber groups. If bomber groups were going somewhere that was especially dangerous, or they knew there was a lot of enemy fighters, it was not uncommon for them to say, hey, we'd like these guys to protect us. And one of the reasons is that the 332nd's commander, Ben Davis, who was also one of the first commanders of the 99th Pursuit Squadron, was adamant that their mission was to protect the bombers, not to go off and shoot down enemy fighter planes. So one theory was the best way to protect the bombers was when the enemy fighter planes came up, the fighter cover would go chase them and shoot them down and more or less leave the bombers unprotected. Ben Davis didn't agree with that, so he wanted his fighter planes to shoot down the enemy fighter planes if they could, but the main thing was to keep them away from the bombers and protect the bombers. So the focus was a little different. A lot of the bomber crews couldn't believe that the guys that were flying those red tail planes were African Americans. They just couldn't believe it because, at that time, the cultural norm was that African Americans can't do that kind of thing. Well, yeah, they could, and they did it really, really well. And so the 332nd with the 99th, still wound up dealing with a lot of issues, but they really proved that war study was bunk, that not only could African Americans excel in the Air Corps as pilots and technical personnel, they blew it out of the water. They were some of the best in the Air Corps. And again, sort of circling back around, that training process and that bringing together those men of such high quality began at Chanute Field. I've had the pleasure of meeting several of the Tuskegee Airmen, and it's really easy to get starstruck when you understand what they did and what they overcame, and just how humble they are about it. Lots and lots of resources out there. I would encourage anyone to read anything that's written by one of these Tuskegee Airmen, because you just keep going deeper and deeper and deeper about their connections, not only to Champaign, but Chicago and Illinois in general has been a huge player in the Tuskegee Airmen story, just with the people who have come here, had connections here. A lot of the original Tuskegee Airmen wound up back at Chanute later for, if they stayed in the military after the war, for different trainings that they would go through. For example, Charles McGee, who has strong connections to Champaign, was a fighter pilot during World War II. He wound up coming back to Chanute. He stayed in the military, wound up coming back to Chanute later to do officer maintenance training at Chanute. One of the first Black commanders of the 99th Pursuit Squadron was George Roberts. He wound up coming back to Chanute later in his career and became the first African American to command, I'm not going to get my terminology right here, but to command a major base unit at Chanute. So all kinds of interconnections that come through Champaign, Chanute, Illinois. And these men also, even after they got out of military service, they went out into the community and were community leaders in basically all fields. There were judges and lawyers and doctors and that just have impacts that just sort of spiderweb out into the community. So, yeah.